Hello and welcome back to another webinar in the series of Deep Dive AI hosted by the Open Source Initiative. Today we're going to be hearing from Mike Nolan about the ideology of free and open source software and AI, what open means relating to platforms and the black box systems. We're going to be taking questions at the end, so please enjoy and stay with us.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Nolan. I have a few titles. So I predominantly work at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm the Associate Director of Open at RIT, which is the university's sort of open programs office. I do a bunch of work across open source software, open data, open science, stuff like that within our university. I'm also the current executive director and founding member of the Federation of Humanitarian Technologists, which is a British nonprofit that essentially helps build open source software for the humanitarian aid sector. I'm a board member for the Organization for Ethical Source. And then finally, I like to consider myself a scholar of political economy, science, and technology. All this is to say that, I'm very much interested in the field of open source and, the kind of work that we're discussing today. So for this talk, I want to talk about the ideology of free and open source software and kind of how it applies to AI. I also want to talk a little bit about digital platforms and sort of talk about this history of free and open source software, the ideology that underpinned it in the initial conception of it, how the software has changed, and sort of kind of go into exploring where we are today and if we have any sort of real ideological grounds that can help us imagine how this sort of concepts can apply to evolving in new technologies like AI. But before I go into that, about a month ago, as I was starting to really put together the slides for this talk, this really amazing paper came out called Open for Business, Big Tech, Concentrated Power in the Political Economy of Open AI. And in this case, they're talking about Open AI as like, an open source AI, not the organization. Although the organization is mentioned in this paper. This paper by David Gray Witter, Meredith Whitaker, and Sarah Myers West really heavily influenced this talk. In fact, when I read the paper, I felt kind of deflated in a sense because really, if there is one thing I think anyone listening to this talk should do is to go download this paper. It's available in open access, and give it a read because I think this is probably the best piece of research regarding this topic that I've seen put out, and it was put out in such a timely, at a timely moment. And so I'm gonna summarize some aspects of this paper to the best of my ability. Obviously, I'm not an author on this paper. I had no involvement in this. And if you see my name cited in it, it wasn't actually me. It's just a common name. So I'll talk about some parts of this paper and I'll cite those sections when I do. But on to this talk. I tried to break it up essentially into 4 key portions. The first is I wanted to provide, a short history of open source and free software to provide some context. And then I want to talk about the changing form of software over the last 50 years. And how that might impact our perceptions of what is open and the importance openness plays in how we relate to software systems and how we impact them. Then I want to kind of get into some of the contents of this paper around how people conceive various aspects of open source AI, like what sort of spectrum of openness is there. And then I want to go into some pros and cons of OpenAI from like a kind of material standpoint. I want to talk about a lot of claims that people are making, particularly surrounding this new European regulation of OpenAI. And then finally, I kind of want to bring it all back home and see, if we really have any good standing as people invested in this term open and this, I guess, kind of community that has been built over the last 50 years around this modes of collaboration and the ideology surrounding it. So yeah, here we go. So how did we get to where we are today? I'm sure many people, if not most, are probably pretty familiar with the history of open source. And so I'm going to try to breeze through it, but I'm going to try to reframe a couple aspects of it in a way that I think will be useful for setting the context of this talk. So, starting from like roughly around the 1970s is where I would say software commodification began to happen. So right before this, when you bought computing machinery, it came essentially like pre-installed with software. The software is built to run on that hardware platform and wasn't easily transitioned to others. But at a certain point, hardware platforms started to become standardized. Personal computing became popularized, and so alongside this, the production of software as a commodity became extremely popular. And you see these huge businesses, particularly businesses like Microsoft, essentially making a name for themselves by taking advantage of this massively growing market. And the way this worked is, these companies, they would build pieces of software and then they would use licensing to essentially sell that software to people. And at the same time, so did the development of, the most early stages of what we call like free or open source software, with communities, grassroots communities, building software, pieces of software, sharing it with each other, and developing in this sort of peer-to-peer commons-based method of production. And so with this, I think is where we begin to see some of the initial ideological pillars around free and open source software begin to form. I think one of the best examples of this is, the four freedoms initially proposed by folks like Richard Stallman, where they viewed people's relation to software as something that requires these fundamental rights about, in order to provide people a sense of autonomy and control over the software that they utilized, right? And so the four freedoms to be able to run the program, to study it and view the code, to redistribute, and then to make modifications and distribute those modified copies is kind of the foundational idea around how people needed, how people deserved to interact with the software that they're utilizing. And I think this is really important because when we think about the conceptions of software at the time, it was largely these discrete programs that you would take, on a floppy disk or whatever, and you would plug it into your machine, and then you would run it, and it would largely run just on your machine, right? And so control was around, be able to control that box of software that you had access to. And so, this ideology wasn't something that was shared among everyone at the time, right? In fact, there was a lot of antagonism during this period between folks who were championing this sort of new idea around user autonomy and control over software, and businesses that were trying to utilize access to investment to build software products and to sell them to people in a way that could sustain their business, right? And so at this time there was a lot of headbutting, right? And there was a lot of I guess I would say like marketing or propaganda around both sides I think it's not unheard of for, free software or open source advocates to have been considered something like a communist or an anarchist at the time. Open source software was described as a cancer by some in the software industry, and so there was a lot of antagonism between these two groups. And that's not to say that many didn't try to kind of find a compromise between these two groups and to show that open source software was not something as politically radical as like communism or whatever. In fact, it could provide a lot of benefits to these same companies in terms of its development methodology. And so, through this period, especially during the popularization of the term open source and the adoption of it, we begin to see new definitions come out and new conceptions about what open is. Particularly, I think as everyone here is familiar with, this very legalistic definition of open source in relation to a software license, right? Which, is quite different than what we think about with like a human rights based approach to people in relation to software. This is a very legalistic, almost contract based understanding of what open source is. And this sort of is the foundation of the OSI definition, which is largely kind of stayed fairly static over the, since its conception. And so this compromise and these arguments about, the benefits that open source software production as a methodology could bring, it really worked in many ways. I'm sure many of you have seen this figure or one similar to it about how pervasive open source software is in our digital infrastructure. It is pretty much the foundation, the bedrock of like any sort of digital infrastructure or service that is being built today. And it's based upon this figure that many people argue, open source has won, right? It's got this huge adoption. It's so many people are investing in it. It's so important. And so this was the right path. We convinced, we brought everyone together. We formed this amazing coalition of diverse organizations and figured it out together. And so, this is kind of the common history, but I think it's important when understanding how this all happened to also keep in mind the changing form of software, right? So in the early, as I mentioned, in the early days of software commodification, software was very discrete, right? They were largely end user products or applications that would run on their own. You would download them. And, it's important to note when considering the software market between free and open source software applications and proprietary applications that they directly competed in most cases, right? You have Firefox and Internet Explorer, you had Linux and Windows, you have GIMP and Photoshop. Many of the most important free and open source software applications at the time were directly competing with like very big proprietary applications that had huge market share. So this really puts into perspective why so many companies felt threatened by open source software, and it kind of puts into perspective their reaction to it, whether it was justified or not, or more moralistic or not. And so this was certainly the case during the early days of open source software. But now if we consider, some of the 25 most important, free and open source software applications today, we see something very different, right? First of all, we see that firms have huge involvement in the development of these free and open source software applications, right? And we also see that these aren't really necessarily end user products anymore, right? These aren't necessarily things that maybe outside of software developers, people would really interact with in a way that they understand it or they know it. Obviously, many of these are dependencies of many software applications that we interact with, but they aren't like direct things that we're downloading onto our computer, installing and running and configuring and so on. And I would argue that, over this time, as these software products became adopted more heavily, that the use of software has shifted towards things that I'm going to call platforms, right? And platform is oftentimes a loaded term. It has a lot of different definitions, and so the definition I'm going to pull from is largely like an economics-based definition. It was coined by Lerner and Tirole, who are these two Nobel Prize-winning economists. I encourage you to look it up if you're interested in kind of this framing of it. But the way they describe a platform is it's something that sits in between multiple networks or markets and monopolizes the connection between these two things, right? Um, so, I think the best way to describe this would be maybe providing examples. Uh, so for instance, Facebook is a platform that manages access to communities and media for end users on one side, and then willing eyes, data, and ad positioning for advertisers on the other side, right? And in these two things previously, before this platform, would have trouble finding that connection, and through Facebook or I guess Meta now, they can. Another example of this is Amazon, which is a platform that facilitates access to distribution networks and a global marketplace for producers on one side, and a network of goods and services for consumers on the other side, right? Finally, something like Google Search is a platform that facilitates access to information and digital services for end users. The production of information and like the discoverability for producers of these goods and services, and then also willing eyes and user networks for digital service providers and advertisers. So the nature of the platform has positioned their creators to exploit these multi-sided markets by acting as a mediator and gatekeeper, right, between various actors and various sides. So as the person controlling the platform, you aren't necessarily like providing a piece of software as a product as we traditionally understand it, but rather your software is a necessary system that people need to go through in order to access other commodities, goods, resources, information that they need to do whatever it is that they want to do. And so going back to this this sort of table of really critical open source software, like there's I think it's fairly easy to identify how these pieces of open source software they aren't just extremely useful to the production and maintenance of these platforms, but they're also built explicitly for them, right? Whether we see like server orchestration software, distributed computing, highly scalable search products. These pieces of software are built specifically for massive distributed computing systems that have millions or billions of users, and need a specific type of architecture in order to manage access between so many people, so many goods and services, and so many markets. So, I think it's important to understand this shift, because with platforms, software is no longer discrete, right? It's wide ranging, and the role it plays isn't providing a tool for a specific person, right? But rather it's a gatekeeper to other things. And it's not to conflate platforms with AI, but I think the shift towards this this sort of idea of what a lot of the computing systems that we interact with, this shift in their purpose is really important when considering open AI. So with that, let's talk a little bit about open AI or open source. AI. And so this is where I'm going to pull the most from this paper. And so if you're interested, the slides are online. I encourage you to take a look at them. It's linked here, or you can just search the title of it online. It'll be like the first thing that comes up. But this section is largely pulling from that paper. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to read the paper and not just go off of what I said. So when defining OpenAI, I think there's generally four main components that people think about of like where are the materials that are being distributed, openly, or that we consider like a part of an open AI. And the first is obviously the data that was utilized to train and evaluate any sort of AI model, and that data being available and how accessible it is and so on. The second thing is the source code that defines, the model's architecture and the hyperparameter settings, and that data being, released, or that code being released under a typical open source license. The third thing is the AI model itself, right? This is the weights that have been determined through the process of training, which is oftentimes very costly. So the model is a product that can be distributed and often is. And then the last thing is kind of a quote unquote documentation, which exists in a lot of different forms. But, I think a common idea of this documentation isn't just like documented code, but things like model cards or data sheets that have been really popularized over time. So I think these four things are kind of like the four components that people are often discussing around like what when considering what an open source AI should be. Like these are the four things that I think a lot of people think about as integral to the AI. But I think there's also a number of other things that are incredibly important to consider that go into the creation and distribution of AI that aren't necessarily work products, and heavily affect like what we think of as the end product. And so the first thing is development frameworks. And so I would say there's two very popular ones, PyTorch and TensorFlow. Both of these are open source. PyTorch was created by Facebook or Meta Corporation, and TensorFlow was created by Google. The vast majority of contributors to both of these frameworks are representative of their creating companies. And so these development frameworks, while being open source, really impact the development of other AI systems because they're the foundational component that people use to define their models and determine how integration with other systems might happen. And so, these steering framework, these framework development frameworks standardize AI construction, so it's compatible with their own company platforms, right? And so that ensures that this framework leads downstream developers to create AI systems that Lego-like can snap into place within the company systems of the creator of that framework. And I think this is something really important to keep in mind when thinking about the pros and cons of AI and the ramifications of an open AI system. The next thing is compute, as we all know, especially when creating large models and training large models, massive amounts of computing power is needed in order to do that. This sort of computing power is rare, is pretty much never accessible to individuals and only to extremely well-financed, largely private sector companies, right? And the same goes for data, that the collecting, storing, and ingesting of data is extremely expensive. Oftentimes access to that data, like the legality of it, with copyright laws, is very much in a gray area, and something that I would say is a big factor in why, with so many of our large base models like GPT-4, Bard, PaLM 2, very little is known about like what this data actually is. right? And I would say the legality of access to information is probably a big reason of that. And then finally, going on to labor is important at all aspects of the creation of AI, but I would argue particularly in the curation, data labeling, classification, content moderation. Um, the you know this is a very labor intensive aspect of the creation of AI that is oftentimes overlooked and oftentimes is very colonial in its structure, right? Many, many Western technology firms will utilize, quote unquote, cheap labor from the global South in order to perform this labor at large scales, usually going through a number of subcontractors to do so in order to distance themselves from, any sort of potential harm that could happen to that workforce. And this labor is critical to the development of these systems. In fact, it's probably the most foundational component of it. And then finally, when considering the creation of AI, understanding the lineage of development of AI models, where we have base models and then we have models that have built upon that and tweaked in some forms. It's important to note that with the development of AI systems, that lineage is extremely important in determining what sort of innovations can be had, right? The development of base models provides a pretty narrow idea of what can be actually evolved from that, especially with when done with folks that have limited resources in comparison to those who have created the base model. So with these five things, I think there has been a fair bit of research determining kind of like how we can evaluate like the openness of various types of AI. This paper by Suleiman had this really cool sort of spectrum of openness in evaluating large language models. I believe this was actually also in the earlier paper that I cited as well. But this is kind of like a good idea of when thinking about like a maximally open AI model and then a maximally closed AI model and then like what sits in between. I thought this was kind of a good example of sort of the various stages that might exist. And as you might see, like with these various stages, there's various types of pros and cons that come along with it, where like more open models are more community centric, they're more easily auditable, but they don't have as much control over risk, they don't have as much centralized control, stuff like that. And so with that, I kind of want to go into the pros and cons of open. And this is, I think, where we begin to touch on like topics around this like new regulation around AI and the significant amount of lobbying that I've seen in kind of open source communities around this, in particular by representatives of companies, but certainly kind of acolytes that have been, I guess, also discussing or using similar points. So in general, and this is still pulling from the paper, but I think did a pretty good job of summing up the discourse around open source AI and some claims that I see a lot of people making, and so I thought it was worth sharing here. So I guess the first claim that many people are saying is, open AI creates safety through transparency. And this is kind of like a modification of existing claim around open source software, right? Where many eyes make all bugs shallow, right? So because it's transparent, more people can inspect how it works, more people can audit the code, and particularly with these maximally open AI systems where you have access not just to the code, but like the data, the documentation, more and more people can do this sort of evaluation. And therefore safety through that comes about. But it's important to understand that this sort of openness doesn't guarantee audits. And this is very clear in the case of much of our existing open source digital infrastructure, where we see these vulnerabilities exist in key digital infrastructure for a very long time before it is discovered. And oftentimes it's discovered in quite a dangerous way. And this auditing requires dedicated resources with when you have this sort of distributed responsibility is very hard to organize, right? And so there is a potential for safety, but in particular with much of the AI regulation requiring this auditing, but many within the open source sector kind of being against this sort of regulation, there is a bit of I guess contradiction in some of the discourse that I've seen, not to take one side or the other. Another claim I've seen is OpenAI increases insecurity, which in some sense is true. The nature of releasing base models or whatever means people can take that work and reapply it in new contexts, and that reapplication could potentially be harmful, right? On the flip side, this isn't necessarily a good argument for maintaining purely proprietary AI systems. We're already seeing industry concentration is creating toxic competition among AI firms, leading them to release models commercially before they're really ready and before they've undergone any sort of necessary scrutiny or risk mitigation. So a thing being open or closed doesn't necessarily guarantee any sort of auditing system. And so it's important to understand, regardless of open or closed or open or proprietary, we need to consider other sort of safeguards. And these safeguards and these systems of liability are largely what I see much of this proposed regulation trying to do, both in Europe, but also in other countries, like, for instance, China, which has been regulating AI for a couple of years now with a number of different laws. The next one is the claim that OpenAI will reduce industry concentration. This is kind of a natural sort of thing where you see if you have open source software or open products, then many people it's much easier for people to take existing pieces of existing software and develop new innovations and therefore compete in the market, and it makes it harder for people to monopolize certain technologies and so on. And this is oftentimes used in tandem, thinking about regulatory systems, saying more regulation is just going to hurt the little guys because you need to adhere to more sort of processes or have access to more financing in order to ensure that what you're doing is safe and adhering to regulation. And to an extent, this is true. But we're already seeing a lot of homogeneity in the current AI environment, in the current open AI environment, because there's such heavy reliance on just a few corporate produced models. And this sort of connection really impacts what we think about as competition within the AI. And I encourage people who are kind of maybe skeptical of this point to read The Steep Cost of Capture by Meredith Whittaker, which will be linked in the slides here, and take a look at it, who I think makes a pretty good argument towards this. Not to kind of put off that argument, but for the sake of scope, I encourage you to give it a read if you're skeptical. And then the final point is OpenAI is key to innovation. The nature being, the increased competition, the increased accessibility of these various things to people will allow more, geniuses to come through, have access to the resources they need to innovate. And yeah, to an extent, this is potentially true, right? It's certainly, providing more access to the materials people need to do things. can create more innovative solutions. But when thinking about developing derivatives off of these large models, almost all of which are corporate produced for a pretty narrow idea of what AI can provide. This heavily impacts the kind of innovation that can stem from this sort of technology, right? There's always going to be a sort of genealogy in the derivatives of these things, and when thinking about the impact of base models and the base infrastructure and who's creating that, it impacts what can be created from it. And it doesn't, this innovation doesn't necessarily pertain to, incentive structures, systems for creating additional safety or empowering users or anything like that. So I think there's kind of it can be misleading when thinking about just when using the term innovation so broadly. So I know that was kind of a lot, and a lot of it was sort of summarizing, a fairly long paper. But I hope that provides a bit more perspective in thinking about like kind of the pros and cons of OpenAI and how at least I kind of understand this topic. But there's a few points I kind of want to step back on in reflecting on this, and reflecting on this history, and hopefully provide a bit more of a summation of where I think we can go from here. And so the first thing is software is changing, or like software has changed, right? It is changed massively in how we relate to it, and how we interact with it, and in our relation to control over it. These software systems impact many people all at once. They aren't discrete, right? And therefore, we don't have this like individual control over them, and it's almost impossible to envision a way that we could. And largely, in particular, I would argue as a criticism of like the open source community, we have not we have not done a good job of catching up with this in the discourse and envisioning it. And I think in many ways, we have been sort of outmaneuvered by well-financed organizations creating software. And some might see that as good, others might see that as bad. But if there's one thing that we've fallen behind on, is really recognizing this changing form of software and how we relate to it. And because of this, open source still means many different things to many different people. As much as I think we hate to say it, open source, despite the OSI having this definition for such a long time, is probably muddier now than it ever has been. And I think it's fair to an extent to point the finger at others who have been trying to co-opt the term and redefine it. But I think this sort of focus on open source as this very legalized definition, specifically around software licenses, while still maintaining it as like a way of discussing a kind of development methodology, and for others also using it as a term to describe these sort of ideological foundations that this term came out of. It's muddier than ever, and it's made it very difficult for any of us to organize around any of these points, right? And then finally, and perhaps this is, I think, one of the more important points that I'd like to make is, when discussing and determining the value of open source AI, it's important to know that like open AI is not democratized AI. And if there's anything this paper I was trying to go through would show pretty clearly, is like open may provide a sense of transparency, reusability, and extensibility, right? To an extent, right? Even then in the maximally open forms, it's not necessarily like a silver bullet, but it does not provide any sort of democratic control nor meaningful competition. And so when thinking about like the value of open source AI, and this conference, and I assume many of us are trying to organize around this, open doesn't provide these things, at least in any conception that we have of it right now. And I think this is really important because AI is being deployed. It has been deployed, and when thinking about this regulation and the various sorts of kind of impacts that we're imagining, we don't even need to use our imagination, right? We're seeing AI systems being deployed to great effect by organizations to that creates massive, like extreme harm, right? We see people's livelihoods being tied into these systems and ripped away if there is any sort of failure. And there's very little recourse for the people who are affected by these, right? And that is creating great harm. And so, I've been seeing a lot of discourse around the value of open. I've seen a lot of discourse using open as like a replacement for like ethical or good or whatever. And I think we have to be really critical of ourselves, of this topic. And I think it's a good opportunity to take a step back and think about like why this topic was so important to us in the beginning, and what sort of you know ideology kind of pulled us into this topic around us, our relation to the technology that we use, and why it meant so much to us. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Please, as always, feel free to reach out to my email if there's interest or if you want to have any questions that isn't broadcasted. And thank you to the OSI for allowing me to speak.